Just a couple of remarks before I get going. One is Uzma. I'm a lot older now and not as young as I used to be several years ago. But my first encounter with Uzma was around the World Conference on Racism and the preparatory work that was being done in Toronto with the Social Planning Council and some of the other groups that we were preparing for the Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. And Uzma had then a very good analysis of the issue, which has not waned today, some many years later, right? So that's Uzma. Now, Aita. Again, I'm a lot older now. No hair. But Aita has always been an excellent storyteller. And how do I know this? Because in my former life, in the former North York Public Library, Aita used to come to not only my branch, but came to my branch because I asked Aita to come to engage us with her storytelling ability. And so she did many years ago at the Flemington Park Library, Yorkwoods Library, and many of the branches across the city with my colleague in arms, Rob Rolfe, and we used to go to the bookstore and would purchase items for our shelves. But anyways, that's just commerce. So both of these wonderful women have been an inspiration to me and really has inculcated in me some of what folk may see today in terms of the way that I do my work and the kind of analysis that I've learned from them to undertake in many issues. So having said that, let's move forward now. Okay? So Brother Hamilton asked me to come and to recount experiences in Canada, in Canadian society. And so I want to do this, but I want to do this in the form of a journey, right? And I would like to invite you along with me on that journey, if you will. Okay? Now, this journey will be viewed for the most part through the eyes of a youngster who entered Canada in the mid-1960s from a Caribbean nation. Okay. The doors of the airplane opened. The youngster stepped from the plane onto the platform of the stairs, inhales and then exhales to see the vapor of the cold rippling across in the distance. With bright lights of the new land glistening around him as he descends the stairs onto an awaiting bus, which whisks him away to the terminal building. So in those days, you'd have to go down the stairs. There were no sort of path to go on to the terminal directly. This young man's first encounter with his new homeland was his curiosity with people with skates over their shoulder walking to outdoor rink with hockey stick in hand. Developing a love for hockey and becoming proficient enough to play in the Metro Toronto Hockey League, or as it was known then, the MTHL. Then came the experience in school, where this young man encountered strange responses, such as coon, jigaboo, chocolate face, and asking other black boys what that all meant. The young man moved along to junior high school and joined the ability to experience and play team and individual sports. Then moving along to high school, seeing the words Kunta Kinte and Kun written on the walls of the urinals. This time, understanding what that meant and reporting it to the principal and vice principals, respectively, and asking that the matter be addressed with the entire student body. Moving on to further learning and tasked with a special project to build bridges with youngsters in the Jane Finch corridor, as it was referred to then, to build bridges to the library. Having to oversee things the night of a special screening of a film made about Jane Finch residents by the late Jennifer Hodges, the film entitled Home Feeling. The community came out en masse at the Library Theater to view the screening of the film about them and their community. Then Premier David Peterson, the head of the National Film Board of Canada, the mayor of the City of Toronto, and many, many community stalwarts were in attendance. What became evident to this young man, and is worth noting at this juncture, and I quote, "You can't tell the story of the now without telling the story of the past." And this will become more evident as we navigate this young man's experience together. The issues of system, whether it's one in which one works, socialize, or function in terms of one community-based organizing or activities, will be addressed more fully in moments. However, it is said that systems are durable, but have to be broken apart, particularly when one looks around at what is happening in the world, our country, and the labor union today. It may also be worth noting that after some 5 decades, though some things have improved, for the most part, there are still segments of the population which are still struggling to assume its rightful place and space in the Canadian mosaic and social fabric of the Canadian society, as first experienced when this young man came to this new shore. Now, as there may be the temptation to become uneasy or fidgety or even nervous, keep in mind here that this address is from a young man's individual experience and perspective, as experienced by him. Unvarnished, uncoded, unfiltered, and raw, as experienced at the onset of setting foot on these shores. It is equally important to note that nuance is vitally important when addressing this young man's experience in Canada, but even more so when backdropped against community, work, society, and union to which we subscribe and are involved. In order to talk about this young man's Canadian experience or experience in Canada, we have to be able to speak from a place of truth and fact, which at times may and can result in discomfort. However, this is the young man's story and can't be stripped away by the use of some type of paint-stripping solvent. So obviously, our discussion will be as it has already begun to be, from a grassroots and earthy perspective, defining in this young man's own words, spoken word, the topic of discussion. Now, approximately 20 years ago, this same young man was asked to address the topic of, in quotation, achieving equality in tough economic times. Again, I will repeat, achieving equality in tough economic times. This topic was both pivotal and fitting for what was being experienced by minorities, such as this young man, in the Canadian landscape. However, before we go there and tease that out, it's important to know and acknowledge that we are here on sacred ground of the Mississauga Port Credit Aboriginal peoples. In the words of Murphy Brown at a QP gathering, she ascended and rose to the microphone and indicated on a point of personal privilege that when singing the Canadian anthem, the wording should be, our home on native land. But we also stand on the shoulders of those who went before and blazed the trail and path which made it possible for this young man, and yes, us, you and I, to be here celebrating this great and distinguished Canadian, Viola, and sharing our experience in the Canadian society. There were some who immigrated, as already pointed out, to Canada in the 1950s, and some, like this young man, in the 1960s, when the cost of houses were $15,000 to $26,000, and a gallon of gas would go for 26 cents and then rose to 45 cents per gallon. There was a time when the Canadian dollar was stronger than its neighbor to the south. The US, however, we also had a shared experience. As we know, and little talked about, there was the issue of slavery in the South, hence the North-South experience. But so too, as already mentioned, was there slavery in Canada. In fact, it was worth noting that when the South African government was contemplating the Bantustan, that the Canadian Aboriginal reservations formed their guiding principles on how to establish the Bantustans, which proved to contain, threatened, and dealing with an aspect of the population that was considered less than desirable. Okay? You still with me? Okay? So we recognize our home on native land. Let's quickly also recognize those who came before us, on whose shoulders we stand, both from a community, society, workplace, and union context. Some of these names and individuals you will recognize, but who contributed in igniting the renewed, revitalized commitment in advancing the struggle for equality for all persons, in particular, persons of color, Black and Indigenous persons. The roll call: Otis Richmond, Uzma, Ita, Lester Donaldson, Michael Wade Lawson, Holman Louis, Michael Chan, Angela Malman, Robin Rolfe, David Onyalo, George Williams, Hassan Yusuf, Lynn Jones, Harminder Singh Magon, Peter Charles, Mervis White, Carmen Henry, Joan Stevenson, Peter Marceline, Ken Amoroso, Carl Downs, Livingston Holder, Muriel Collins, Steve Edwards, Avril Sargent, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile, Sammy Yatim, Viola Desmond, Portia White, Jack White, Malcolm X, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Barack and Michelle Obama, Stanley Grizzle, Bromley Armstrong, Juanita Westmoreland Traore, Dudley Laws, Lennox Farrell, Charlie Roach, Murphy Brown, Janice Geary, Harry Jerome, June Veacock, the BBPA, Albert Johnson, Alvin Curling, Lincoln Alexander, and all of those who you are thinking about that I've not mentioned given the time constraints. These are individuals, and those within your thoughts and mindset are who assisted in igniting change in community, in society, in the workplace, and in the union. The 1970s were tumultuous times for blacks in Canada. Accessing jobs, apartment, housing was challenging for many newcomers who came largely as domestics, some who found work just down the street in the garment industry along Spadina Avenue. Blacks were few and far between in the early years. And when one met another, they would take their phone numbers to keep contact. Applying for jobs were usually met with, when one called about the ad in the paper, yes, the position is still available, but when they showed up and they saw who you were, those positions were no longer available but filled. It wasn't easy to discern a name that was British sort of oriented over the phone and being able to equate it to a black or minority individual. And it was the same for renting apartments. Over the phone, it was all well. When you showed up, the apartment was taken. The turbulence continued. Police were targeting black people. Lincoln Alexander, in his book, Go to School, You Are a Little Black Boy, a memoir, spoke eloquently and at length about the treatment of blacks at the hands of police. It was Kinsley Gilliam, the communications director of BADSI, or the Black Action Defense Committee, who said a lot of this was unnecessary and unjust. Okay? Now, as an aside, at that time, the black community was told who could speak for them and who could not, right? And for a lot of years, it was said, people would side up and say, Dudley Laws doesn't speak for me. But I tell you, for myself, Dudley Laws and everyone else who spoke out about injustice spoke for me. Okay? Now, change in the way human dignity is understood was propelled by the incarceration of Nelson Mandela. The impact of his incarceration, that his incarceration had on many, energized many who were working at the grassroots, doing the earthy union work, trying to level the playing field. It is said, and I quote, that you have to shock people into paying attention, end quote. The killing of Emmett Till was a catalyst for civil rights, for the civil rights movement. not to mention the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now, let's look at the unionized context as we roll towards home here. How many here have ever heard of the OMC? A couple? Okay. How many have ever heard of the Ontario Human Rights Committee? Okay. The OMC, that underground movement, evolved as a result of the lack of visible presence at all levels of the union movement, the Canadian Labour Congress, and its affiliates. Report cards were initiated by Sister June Veacock. And what that report card was doing was that was grading all of the affiliates, giving them a pass or failing grade based on whether they represented or reflected the many people of color who were paying dues into those labor affiliate and labor bodies. This, sisters and brothers, energized the OMC, who met frequently at libraries across the city, strategizing for change, drafting resolutions for members to take to their provincial divisions across the country, to their national unions across the country, and local unions for positions of equity VPs, which Brother Hamilton holds, and places on the executive boards of their local unions. Those spots were few and far between for blacks, visible minorities, and Aboriginal peoples. The ONC developed bylaw changes, resolutions, rationale for equity committees in various locals across the country, for diversity executive positions in affiliate unions across the country, and on national executive boards, including the Canadian Labour Congress. The union through the mid to late 70s through to the 80s and 90s was a natural home for equality rights activists to enhance their community organizing and activism, fighting for social change, economic, and representation changes. The struggle was tough and often unyielding. Many were hurt along the way and suffered health issues in the quest to carve out space, a voice, and representation for the many. As mentioned at the outset, these types of celebrations that we're having today, forums, conferences, workshops, were hard fought for to get blacks, workers of color, and Aboriginal people to gain attendance, just to be able to attend. They did not just happen by osmosis, or because some generous soul or person thought you should be on an executive committee, a board, a bargaining team, or be able to attend a workshop or a conference or a convention. There was a lot of ghost writing behind the scenes. Lobbying for change on all fronts, writing women's committee reports to conventions, human rights committee reports, National Rainbow and other card committees against racism and discrimination reports, to conventions, to national conventions for the affiliates across the country, including provincial divisions, and resolutions across unions as well. What those in the roll call were affirmed of was, and I quote, "The real goal of racism is to repress, oppose, and contain. So pressure groups like the OMC and many other already mentioned had to fight for a space, a voice, with vote, and representation on agencies, boards, and commissions. In conclusion, the danger, as seen through the eyes of this young man, is a change in the swing of the pendulum, as already mentioned by Uzma and Aita. The erosion of progress, of hard-fought gains. The sharing of this young man's experience is not to be seen as a feel-good or a feel-bad experience, but rather as a catalyst for continued change, advancing the issues, moving the yardstick, advocating for change, blazing the path and trail for others coming behind, who will eventually replace us, yes, you and I. Resist those who would seek to contain, marginalize, say all manner of things in opposition to you, and suss upon you, in the words of Robert Nesta Marley, or speak ill of you, as plainly put. Continue to enjoy the remainder of your Black History Month celebration across this new amalgamated city of Toronto. Thank you.